All right, so as I described, my whole life I was a communist, anti-white, Marxist. Then 2014, I became a nationalist, pro-white. Then 2015, became a communist, anti-white, anti-religion. Then 2016 to 2020, became pro-white, pro-religion, nationalist again. And then in 2020, I became a communist, anti-religious, anti-white person again. So I'll kind of describe how that looked. So as I said, in 2020, I went to visit my grandpa in Washington. He moved in 2019 to Washington. And like I said, at the time I was a right-winger. And I no longer was like an anti-white communist, right? But then when I went to visit my grandpa was telling me, like, you know, if you're going to stay with me, you're going to need to get a job. He said, and then, you know, I was telling my grandpa how I wanted to talk to my mom and dad, and I wanted to see my mom and dad, and I thought it was not good that my mom and dad wouldn't see me, you know, because my mom and dad hadn't really seen me since high school, really. And, you know, my mom assumed that I had a mental illness, and I'll kind of describe, like, the way that kind of worked. So, like, in high school, like I said, shoot away messed up my shot. It caused problems, and I'll get to that more in the details later. But I think, you know, like, one of the main problems with that was my grandpa's, it was his philosophy. It was his philosophy that didn't help the situation. It made things worse. So, for instance, in high school, like I said, if it wasn't for the shoot away machine, none of this stuff would have happened. But my grandpa was like, you know, at the time he was trying to teach me his metapsychiatry, transpersonal psychology. So he's like, you know, all you can do, you can't change other people. All you can do is take responsibility for yourself and change yourself. And it's not yourself that you change, because there is no self. It's your software. So you can't change other people, but all you can do is you can upgrade your software. Because, you know, because other people, you can't change them. They have to want to change themselves, and they have to want to upgrade their software themselves. So my grandpa admitted that my mom and dad expressed dualistic primitive software, but my grandpa was like, you know, you can't change them, you know, either through pain or through other factors, possibilities which pull, or pain which pushes, or whatever. They are going to want to upgrade their software. But he was like, but you can't make things happen. You can't change people's software. But the problem was, at the time, my grandpa didn't know it was a shoot away machine that messed up my shot. I didn't know either. My grandpa thought it was me. My grandpa thought that I was playing as bigger, better players, and I was upset with my dad, and I was taking my frustration out on my dad. And he, again, a victim blamer. He didn't know anything was going on. He had no idea how good of a basketball player I was, and I was excelling and doing, you know, I was a starting point guard on varsity as a freshman. No one, you know, we won the CIF championship. Ronaldo wasn't playing. My grandpa was like, oh, when he looked at videos in 2019, Ronaldo didn't play on varsity? Like, he didn't know how good I was. And I would have continued to get better, way better, but the shoot away messed up my shot. And I can describe what happened. And then my dad, you know, my dad tried to help me my whole life, but then my grandpa, again, wanted to blame me. He was like, you know, in 2016, he's like, well, why did you want your dad to help you? You know, your dad never played basketball. Like, trying to blame me, make me the bad guy. No, my dad was the reason I was such a good shooter, because he was the one who would tell me shoot sideways. And he helped me my whole life, and he shot with me every day my whole life. Never one day did he not shoot with me. But when he got the shoot away machine, my dad was like, you know, shoot sideways, what's going on? But it coincided with me shooting overhead, so he probably thought that I wasn't shooting sideways because I was shooting overhead. But no, I know, and I look at the videos, and I can show explicitly how good shooters shoot with the way they move into shots. It was because of the shoot away. But my dad didn't know that. And so my dad was like, well, shoot sideways. And then, you know, and he tried to artificially make me shoot sideways, and he told me to do the wrong thing with my feet, and it messed up everything, right? But my point is, my grandpa was like, well, you know, he didn't know that. He didn't know it was a shooting machine. He thought that I just wasn't that good of a player, and that I was taking my frustration out on my dad. I didn't take out frustration on my dad. I just needed help with my shot, and he helped me my whole life. But then you know, but there was a problem. The shoot away was messing up my shot. So my dad would be like, oh, I give up, you suck now. And then I'd be like, Dad, you know, just shoot with me for 15 minutes. Can you shoot with me for 15 minutes just like once a week? And then, but my dad would be like, no. And then my grandpa's like, well, Ryan, you have to learn to accept bad calls. You have to, you know, you can't change other people. You know, you can't change other people. The only thing you can do is you can upgrade your software. And again, he didn't know the shoot away machine was a problem. He thought it was just something wrong with me. And that's what my mom and dad thought. My mom was like, you know, you just couldn't handle the pressure. You know, so you fell apart. No, it really wasn't that. I was huge. It had nothing to do with the pressure. I was a great player. I was unconscious still. It was a shoot away machine. So my mom's like, you know, so it just led to huge problems. And then, but my grandpa's like, well, you know, Ryan, you can't change other people. You can only change yourselves. And it's that whole thing of take responsibility for everything. All you can do is work on yourself. That's the thing. So, but then my mom and dad heard that and they're like, yeah, Ryan, you can't change us. You know, you have to learn to accept bad calls. You know, my grandpa's like, you know, if you're in the flow, you have a trust. You have a trust in the universe. Everything is just fine. You know, Bill Russell, when he was a professional basketball player, you know, people were racist against him, but one day he just said everything is just fine. He didn't fight the racism. You see, when I was a Marxist communist, I thought that, you know, like fighting would be good. You know, to fight it would be sometimes it's beneficial. But my grandpa's like, I always thought that he was a nationalist white supremacist because he's like, you don't fight it. He just accepted everything is just fine. And I was like, yeah, again, typical religious, like just be a meditative state and just accept the status quo. And, you know, and again, and I do think that my grandpa's philosophy screwed up the whole situation, because then my mom and dad are like, yeah, Ryan, you can't change us. You have to accept our calls. Ryan, everything is just fine. But I needed help with my shot. Things weren't just fine. Things were terrible. My dad was upset about my shot. My dad continued to try to help me with it, but he couldn't, because we didn't know it was a shoot away machine that was messing it up. So it's just a tragic situation. And that's what I want to tell them. I want to tell them, like, let's move on, because if it wasn't for the tragic situation of the shoot away, none of this stuff would have happened. And the thing is, like, and I could say, oh, my grandpa's the one to blame, but I don't. And I try to tell my grandpa, you're not the one to blame. It's not necessarily you. You didn't help the situation, but, you know, it would have been bad regardless because of the shoot away machine. No matter what, the situation would have been bad. It wasn't because of me. It was because of the shoot away machine. But my grandpa's like, he had this whole thing. Oh, you just have to take responsibility for upgrading your software and accept bad calls. Your mom and dad, your dad might be making a bad call and not helping you shoot this week or this month, or, you know, not, because I told the psychologist, let's just do like once a week, 15 minutes. My dad will watch me shoot, and then he could help to try to fix my shot just once a week. But my dad was like, no, I don't want to do that. My grandpa's like, well, he might be making a bad call, but you have, you know, if you're in the flow, you accept bad calls. That's one thing you have to learn, and you can't change people. You can only, you can't upgrade your dad's software. You can only upgrade your own software. That's all you have power over. You know, you can't change other people. And my mom and dad are like, yeah, you can't change us. Do you understand that, Ryan? You can't change us. So they misappropriated my grandpa's teachings, and his transpersonal teachings, and they made him into they utilize them in an impersonal manner. So, and then that carried on to this point. So my grandpa was like, this is 2020, and I'm telling my grandpa, Grandpa, I want to talk to my mom and dad, and I'd like to see them. And, I did discover the theory of everything, but my grandpa's like, Ryan, your mom and dad don't want to talk to you because you still depend on them, because you still, you're not working, you don't have a job, and you're still dependent on them, and they resent that. And my grandpa was like, and the thing is, Ryan, you resent that as well. You don't know that, but you also resent it, that you are dependent on them. And this is carrying over from high school, when my grandpa was like, when the whole shoot away situation happened. My grandpa, again, he came in and he misdiagnosed everything, and he just made everything worse. And my grandpa was like, well, I think what's going on is Ryan just wants independence, and he's just he like most people in high school, he wants to be dependent of his mom and dad. And that's why he's having conflict with his dad. He didn't know what was going on. My grandpa came from Kauai. He didn't know what was going on. He didn't know how good of a player I was. He didn't know about the shoot away machine. He just came in and he just misdiagnosed everything and made things 1,000 times worse. So he's like, what I think is Ryan just wants independence. And, like most people around the age of high school, like Ryan, they want independence and they start to rebel. And that's why he's having conflict with his dad. No, it had nothing to do with that. It had to do with the shoot away machine. My shot messed up, and I didn't want independence. I wanted more help. I wanted help. And really, it would have been nice if someone would have just figured out the shoot away machine was a problem, but nobody did. So, but that made things 1,000 times worse, because then my mom were like, oh yeah, okay, we'll make him independent. Get him out of our lives. Kick him out of the house, and don't talk to him, and let's neglect him, and let's be dismissive of him, and let's hate him. So my grandpa's like, yeah, that's really what Ryan wants, actually. Ryan just wants independence. I didn't want independence. I wanted more love. I wanted more support, and I didn't get it. And then at this point in 2020, when he wanted more love, I wanted some more support. I discovered the theory of everything. I didn't want independence. I wanted to see my mom and dad. I wanted them to support me, and I wanted help. But my grandpa's like, Ryan, you don't get it. What you really want is you want independence. You're still dependent on your mom and dad, and you resent them for that. And they resent you. And only once you become independent will things start going better for you. And I'm like, Grandpa, you don't get it. that's not what I want. I don't want independence. I want to talk to them. And my grandpa's like, well, they don't want to talk to you because they resent you because you're dependent on them. And you don't realize this, Ryan, but you resent them as well because people resent it when they are dependent on somebody. And again, I was like, this was that whole right-wing stuff. Like, oh, no welfare, if you give welfare, then, that's negative because then you become dependent. And, and again, when I was a communist anti-white person, I hated my grandpa's ideas because I was like, Grandpa, you're just a white supremacist. You're just a right winger. I don't like you. But then at this point though, I was like, in my mind, I'm like, I was a right winger as well. I was a white supremacist as well. So I'm like, listen, I didn't say this, but in my mind, I'm like, listen, I'm not one of those fucking black people who's just like on welfare and taking advantage of the system. I'm not a brown person on welfare taking advantage of the system. I discovered the theory of everything. If I didn't discover the theory of everything, I would have a job. I would be doing stuff. But I discovered something really huge, and I work on it 24/7. And when I would tell my mom, like I tried to tell my mom this in college, after college, again, my mom wouldn't talk to me, but a few times I could say a few words to her, right? She lived in Texas, and I never really saw my mom since high school, but I talked to my mom a few times. And I tell her, Mom, my mom's like, I tell her, Mom, I discovered the theory of everything. And then my mom would be like, no, you didn't. You have a mental illness. You're schizophrenic. I'm like, no, I don't have a mental illness. I discovered theory of everything, and it takes all my time. I would like your support. Can you guys help me? And my mom would be like, no, this is a mental illness. You're mentally ill. You have schizophrenia. That's not true. I did discover theory of everything, and it's crazy. I know 99.9% of people who think they discovered theory of everything did not me. So, so my grandpa basically made things 1,000 times worse because he's like, yeah, what you really want is dependence. I'm like, no, that's not what I want. I want to talk to mom and dad. Well, they don't want to talk to you because they resent you because you are dependent on them. And I'm like, they should talk to me anyways. And then my grandpa would later admit, he'd be like, well, yes, I know if they do express dualistic software and predator-prey software and they are immature, your grandpa's they're not immature. It's their software because it's never them because there is no person, but they're immature. But you can't change other people. You can only change yourself. You can only upgrade your software. And, so again, my mom and dad would take my grandpa's teachings and they used it to justify their impersonal, immature behavior. So they would be, they in their mind are thinking, yeah, he can't change us. He needs to accept no for an answer. We just want him to be independent. That's why we don't talk to him. That's why we don't see him. We just want him to be independent. So, yeah, so it was just a tragic, horrible situation. So I'm in Washington in 2020 visiting my grandpa for a week, and I wanted to stay with my grandpa because I wanted to get out of where I was living because I lived in an alley where there's constant car noise. I hated it, and I wanted to move, but my mom wouldn't let me move because my mom, again, she hated me, and she's like, well, you can't, if you can't have your cake and eat it too. She had a contempt for me. She hated me, and rather than just being a supportive person who would talk to me and care for me and stuff, my mom's like, no, you get if you're going to be dependent on me, then I'm going to decide where you live, and I'm going to put you in an alleyway where you're going to be miserable. So, it's like a terrible situation. And again, that's what I wanted. I wanted to see my mom and dad, for them to stop hating me, for them to stop having contempt. But my grandpa's like, well, if you get a job and you start becoming dependent, then that will happen. But that's not true. And I knew that. I knew that my mom and dad, even if I had a job, they wouldn't talk to me because they had a contempt for me and a hatred for me from high school because of the shoot-away machine. They thought there was something wrong with me. They didn't know it was a shoot-away machine. So I'm trying to tell my grandpa, like, no, Grandpa, I discovered theory of everything. Can I see mom and dad? Can you guys start supporting me? But my grandpa didn't believe it. My grandpa's like, you didn't discover the theory of everything. If you discovered the theory of everything, people would be talking about it. And then, he didn't believe it. And he's like, everything is energy. That's my theory of everything. And it wasn't even true. It's not even true. So, like, his theory was stupid. So, basically, it's just, and the quadrant model is the theory of everything. It really is. I have so much evidence for it. So, but my point is, it's just a tragic, terrible situation. And then, so I'm trying to tell my mom, I'm trying to tell my grandpa, like, yeah, I'd like to talk to my mom and dad, but he's like, no, well, and then so my grandpa's talking about, like, again, talking about his anti-entropic reordering theory. Like, life is an anti-entropic reordering function that works in synergy and counterbalance to the entropy of the universe. So again, my grandpa is like it's like a right-wing thing, like work hard, just go all out, be creative. But again, he tries to utilize things in a very scientific way. Like he tries to make everything naturalistic, but he employs the new age ideas in a very naturalistic way and use like big words, and so it sounds scientific. So, and again, I like that when I was a communist, because I'm like, yeah, you know, I didn't like religion, and I liked the whole scientific aspect because it was anti-religion, anti-God and everything, and I thought that religion was white supremacist. But at this point, I'm like, I'm just like, Grandpa, like, okay, you're talking about the anti-entropic roaring function. He kept on going over it again and again. And I remember my grandma looked at me, and my grandma rolled her eyes. She was like, because my grandpa was like, oh, like he was like cleaning the place. He's like, yeah, synergy is so important, working in counterbalance to the anti-entropic roaring function. Oh. And then so I'm looking at my grandpa like, dude, this guy's fucking goofy. He's a goofy motherfucker. And my grandma looked at me, and my grandma was like, she rolled her eyes, and I was just like, God, it's just so annoying. So, you know, this is going on. And my grandma, like I said, my grandma always hated my grandpa. And this is an ironic thing. My grandpa like talks about, like, my grandpa's supposed to be a psychologist who's supposed to help relationships, and he's supposed to help like people get in transpersonal consciousness, but he couldn't even have a relationship with his own wife who didn't like him. And I remember when I would go visit him in Kauai, like one time my grandma was like being like disrespectful to him. My grandpa started yelling at my grandma. He was like, God damn it, Gloria, blah, blah. And I'm like, and it's like so ironic, because it's like this guy's supposed to be teaching transpersonal consciousness and all this stuff, but he doesn't follow it, you know? So it's like, so I'm in this situation, and in my mind, I'm like, my grandpa made things 1,000 times worse for me, and he's continuing to do it. So he's continuing to do this. So, and it's like, so it was just a really bad situation. So then my grandpa, this is when the COVID hit. So then the COVID hit, but my grandpa, again, he has this new age, because he followed Dr. Horowitz. Dr. Horowitz thing, he was more extreme than my grandpa, but Dr. Horowitz thing was your thoughts create disease. There is no, the physical reality is an illusion, and your thoughts are creating everything. So if you're sick, it's because of your invalid thoughts. And so, but my grandpa tried to make it more naturalistic, like, well, it's not completely because of that, but your thoughts do affect the flow of energy, and they affect your propensity to get sick. But yeah, it does have to do with, if you're in the flow or not. So, the COVID hit, and my grandpa wasn't washing his hands. And then he went to talk to some guy outside, and he didn't wash his hands. And I didn't have Wi-Fi. And my grandpa, the reason why he was talking to this guy outside was he was thinking of getting Wi-Fi. But my grandpa's like, you need to get a job and stuff. If you're going to have Wi-Fi, you have to get a job. And then so my grandpa's talking to the guy about Wi-Fi, and then he's talking to him, and he shakes his hand, and then he goes inside, and he doesn't wash his hands. And this is at the beginning of COVID. And this is when everyone was like, you need to wash your hands. This is like right when COVID hit, and nobody knew what was going on. And I was like, Grandpa, can you wash your hands? And my grandpa was like, no. And I was like, Grandpa, you should wash your hands. But my grandpa, and he would try to explain to me, like, you create your reality with your experience, type of like the new age type of shit. Like, it's so long as I'm not in that world of disease, like if he's not in fear, if he's not in dualistic software, like if he's not in dualistic software, dualistic consciousness, if he's in oneness consciousness, he can't get sick. But in my mind, I'm like, dude, Grandpa, don't test God, right? Like, come on, just wash your hands. They're saying to wash your hands. Please just wash your hands. You just shook a guy's hand, and he was coughing. That was the other thing. The guy was coughing. My grandpa was like, ugh. And again, it's that whole like victim blaming thing. Like, oh, you're sick because of your dualistic software. And that's the way I always saw him, as a victim blamer, and like a right winger victim blamer. And I always saw it as like a right wing thing. But, now I understand. Now I have an idea, like, okay, I understand what he's trying to get at with the flow. But, but then my grandpa got mad at me, and then he started yelling at me. He said, okay, get out of my house. And then the other thing was, I don't remember exactly how it happened, but, he told me, I'm not going to teach you anymore. I'm not interested in teaching you anymore. So now I'm really upset, because my grandpa had just started teaching me again. And I was, just starting to learn more about, starting to learn about existential metapsychiatry, and starting to get an idea of what it was. So I'll get more into that in the next lecture. But I just started to kind of understand it, because he didn't teach me well, and he just confused me. But when I started reading Dr. Horace's book when I was at his place in Washington, I started to understand it better. So I'm going to get into that in a minute. But basically, yeah, I'll talk about that in the next lecture. But basically, this is what was going on, and it was not a good situation. And I felt like my grandpa was just like, I wanted to talk to my mom and dad, see my mom and dad, but my grandpa wasn't helping. He's saying, no, you need to get a job, and once you get a job and be dependent, then they'll talk to you. But later I did get a job, and I was like, Grandpa, I got a job, mom and dad talk to me? And I talked to my mom on the phone, and my mom said, no, we're never going to see you. We're never going to talk to you. Just get that through your head. You have to accept that you can't change people, Ryan. You can't change people. You have to accept our calls. We're never going to talk to you again. We're never going to see you. We're never going to see you again. Your dad's never going to talk to you again. You have to accept that. You have to get that through your head. So, but my grandpa would be like, yeah, you know, she is expressing dualistic software, and I cast pearls of swine, and they misinterpreted my teachings. But regardless, those are his teachings, you know. But the transpersonal teachings, they interpret in an impersonal way, according to my grandpa. But in my opinion, no. My grandpa didn't. He looked down upon me, and he didn't believe in the Quadrant Model. He thought I was crazy. He didn't believe the Quadrant Model, and in my opinion, he wanted my mom and dad to not talk to me or see me. He really did. And I think that he was the one who screwed things up 1,000 times worse than it would have been. He's the one who really made things 1,000 times worse. But like I said, things would have been bad regardless because of the shoot away machine. But he made things worse. So I'll talk about it more in the next talk.